هنقاتل زي ما قلت لكم امبارح لآخر نقطة دم. لن نسلم أبدا. بنبني بلدنا، بنبني تاريخنا، بنبني مستقبلنا. النهارده ده شعار كل مصري.
History is not a timeline. It is a battleground. And some stories, like Egypt's, are written in blood, buried in silence, and passed down in whispers. From 1948 to 1979, the Arab world was set ablaze. A people were uprooted, lands were stolen, wars erupted, dignity was lost, then reclaimed. But how do we know this history? Through whose eyes is it told? And whose voice has been silenced? This is TOKTALK, and I am Tariq. And today we take you through one of the most defining conflicts in modern Arab memory, the Egyptian-Israeli wars. From the Nakba, 1948, to Camp David, through defeat, resistance, resurrection, and the price of peace, 1978. But this time, you'll hear the story through the voice of the people who lived it, felt it, fought for it. This isn't just an episode, it's a reclamation. Because history is not only questioned, it is lived. And today, Egypt speaks.
1948. Al-Nakba, a homeland taken. We now witness the end of the British mandate in Palestine.
Before 1948, Palestine was home to Muslims, Christians, and Jews, coexisting in cities like Jaffa, Haifa, and Jerusalem. Arabic was the language of the land. The call to prayer and church bells rang in the same air. But the seeds of catastrophe were sown in 1917, with the Balfour Declaration, a colonial letter from British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour to a Zionist leader promising a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, a land Britain did not own. One Arab historian would later call it a promise from those who have nothing to those who deserve nothing. May 14, 1948. The British withdrew, and hours later, Israel declared its existence. But this independence came through terror. Militias like the Haganah, Irgun, and Lihi attacked Palestinian villages with ruthless force. Deir Yassin, April 9, 107 civilians massacred, pregnant women shot, children executed. This was psychological warfare. Drive them out by blood. The day after Israel's declaration, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq sent troops into Palestine. The goal? To defend a people being wiped from the map. Egypt's army entered from the south. Battles raged in Fallujah and Gaza. Egypt's forces fought fiercely, though poorly coordinated and under-equipped compared to Zionist units, which had access to superior European arms, many supplied after the Holocaust. The war ended in 1949 with the so-called armistice agreements. But they did not bring peace. They marked the beginning of occupation. Israel had seized 78% of Palestine, far more than the UN partition plan had granted. 700,000 Palestinians became refugees. Layla was 16. Her wedding dress had gold threads stitched by her mother. When gunfire reached her village in Lydda, she ran barefoot toward the hills of the West Bank. Her father was killed in front of the mosque. Her house was taken. She lived and died in a refugee camp in Gaza. She never saw her home again. Israel's victory was not miraculous. It was geopolitical. Western guilt over the Holocaust gave cover to a new colonial project. The United Nations, dominated by colonial powers, recognized a state born from ethnic cleansing. No Palestinian voice was heard. The media called it a miracle, but we saw it as theft. The myth of a land without a people for a people without a land was propaganda, erasing centuries of Arab history. Meanwhile, the Arab states were fractured, Egypt was corrupt, Syria and Iraq were unstable, and Jordan secretly negotiated with Zionist leaders while pretending to defend Palestine. When history is told by those with the loudest voice, whose pain is heard? Is memory a form of evidence? If thousands carry the same story of loss, does it count even without an archive? When documents support one truth and lived experience tells another, how do we decide what counts as knowledge?
1956. The Tripartite Aggression. Egypt defies empire.
رئيس الجمهورية مادة 1 تؤمم الشركة العالمية لقناة السويس البحرية شركة مساهمة مصرية.
Breaking news. President Nasser has nationalized the Suez Canal.
It was July 26, 1956. Nasser stood before the nation and declared, "The Suez Canal is ours. Not Britain's, not France's. Egypt's." He said it with fire in his eyes and 1,000 years of occupation behind his voice. The crowd exploded. The West panicked. The canal wasn't just a waterway. It was the artery of empire, carrying oil, trade, power. So 3 old empires conspired: Britain, France, and Israel. The plan was secret, codenamed Operation Musketeer. Israel would invade first, giving Britain and France a pretext to intervene, pretending to stop the conflict while actually securing the canal. On October 29, 1956, Israeli paratroopers dropped in the Sinai. Tanks moved swiftly, capturing key passes. Days later, British and French planes bombed Egyptian airfields. Warships appeared off Port Said. Civilians were caught in the crossfire. Israel captured the Midla and Gidi passes in 48 hours. French and British air superiority overwhelmed Egypt's limited air force. Port Said saw intense street fighting between Egyptian resistance and elite paratroopers. In Port Said, 12-year-old Rami watched from his balcony as French tanks rolled down the street. His father, a teacher, grabbed a rifle and joined neighborhood men to defend their street corner. When he fell, the boy took his place. He threw stones. That's what he had. That was his war. But something unexpected happened. The world changed. The U.S., fearing Soviet backlash, demanded that Britain and France withdraw. The USSR threatened missile strikes on London and Paris. The 2 colonial giants were humiliated. Israel, forced to retreat from Sinai, was enraged. But Egypt, though bloodied, stood victorious in the court of global opinion. For the first time since pharaohs ruled the Nile, an Arab country had defied Europe and won. The 1956 war wasn't just about the canal, it was about power, pride, and post-colonial identity. Nasser's defiance was symbolic. Egypt was no longer a puppet. The West could no longer dictate without resistance. But make no mistake, Egypt paid in blood. Over 3,000 dead, cities damaged, families displaced. Yet the moral victory was priceless. The Suez Crisis also exposed the cracks in the Western-dominated narrative. The world saw that intervention could mean invasion, that defending peace often masked economic interests. When truth threatens power, is it suppressed or rebranded as radicalism? If a colonized nation tells its story and the colonizer calls it propaganda, whose version enters the textbook? Can victory be measured in military terms alone? Or is dignity a form of knowledge reclaimed?
1967. The Nakba. Silence after defeat.
June 5, 1967. The day began like any other. Cairo's streets stirred with quiet. In the classrooms, students read their Quran before exams. But by mid-morning, the sky turned black, not with clouds, but with fire. Israel launched a surprise airstrike, codenamed Operation Focus, and destroyed over 300 Egyptian aircraft in hours.
We are under attack. Israeli planes have struck Egyptian air bases.
They bombed our runways, our radars, our command posts. We were blinded before we even fought. By the time the sun set, the Arab world had lost more land in 6 days than in 6 centuries of previous invasions. It wasn't just Egypt. Israel attacked Syria and Jordan simultaneously. The goal? To neutralize all Arab military capability and expand territory. They succeeded. Israel captured Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights from Syria, and the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Palestine and lands from Jordan. It was a geopolitical earthquake. Over 300,000 more Palestinians became refugees. Jerusalem was declared Israel's eternal capital. In Cairo, the streets were silent. Radios, once full of patriotic songs, now played Quranic verses for the dead. Israel used preemptive airstrikes, hitting 18 airfields across Egypt in one coordinated wave. Command decentralization in the Egyptian army led to delayed counterattacks. Jordan entered the war on Egypt's request in under 48 hours. Syria lost the Golan Heights after 3 days of fighting, and U.S. satellites tracked the war but did not intervene directly, while the USSR warned but did not act. Miriam's father was a colonel in the Sinai. She never saw him again. His last letter said,
"I will come home after this war. This one will be different."
It wasn't. In Cairo schools, students were told to write essays on what we will do after victory. The teacher cried as she erased the blackboard. 1967 was not just a military defeat, it was an ideological one. The Arab world believed in unity, but was fractured. Nasser, once the titan of pan-Arabism, admitted failure. Syria and Jordan blamed Egypt. Egypt blamed poor intelligence. But the truth was clear. The Arab states were unprepared, disorganized, and overconfident. Israel's success was not luck. It was strategy, backed by Western intelligence, Cold War dynamics, and superior logistics. And in that silence after the war, a new Israeli myth was born, the myth of invincibility. Can a 6-day war rewrite a century of memory? When defeat is too painful to speak of, does forgetting become a kind of survival? If one side dominates the media, the textbooks, and the diplomacy, what happens to the knowledge of the other? Is shame a valid lens through which to study history?
1973, the October War, crossing into dignity.
المسلحة المصرية من اقتحام مانع قناة السويس الأطفال واجتياح خط بارليف المنيع وإقامة رؤوس جسور لها على الضفة.
October 6th, 1973. At precisely 2:05 p.m., 2,000 Egyptian artillery pieces roared in unison across the Suez Canal. The sky cracked open. Ramadan had begun. It was also Yom Kippur, the holiest day in Judaism. But on that day, two worlds collided. Not with prayer, but with fire. What began was Operation Badr, the most audacious and coordinated military maneuver in modern Egyptian history. In the years after the Nakba, Egypt rebuilt. In secret, new radar systems, surface-to-air missile shields, and Soviet-trained pilots prepared for one objective: reclaiming Sinai. Egyptian forces launched a surprise crossing of the Suez Canal along a 170-kilometer front. 13 water cannons breached the massive sand embankment known as the Bar Lev Line. Over 80,000 Egyptian troops crossed the canal in the first wave. Bridge-laying tanks built mobile crossings under fire. Israel, caught off guard, lost hundreds of soldiers and dozens of tanks in the first 48 hours. It was not just military genius, it was personal. Lieutenant Ahmed carried a Quran in his shirt and a letter from his sister in his boot. He led his platoon over the pontoon bridge under relentless air raids. They secured the eastern bank by sunset. His letter was later found soaked in blood and water. As the war progressed, Israel mobilized reserves and counterattacked. With U.S. airlifts pouring in tanks and ammunition under Operation Nickelgrass, Israeli momentum surged in the Golan Heights and eventually in Sinai. The U.S. and USSR stood at the brink. Kissinger flew between capitals. Nuclear alert levels were raised. The Cold War threatened to go hot over Arab land. Meanwhile, Arab oil producers responded with the 1973 oil embargo, shaking the global economy. Egypt didn't regain all of Sinai through force, but it destroyed the illusion of Israeli invincibility. It showed that Arabs could plan, execute, and rise. The Bar-Lev line, once dubbed impregnable, was reduced in hours. The October War forced the West to reconsider its unconditional support. It proved that peace could no longer be demanded. It had to be negotiated. And for Egypt, it was a moment of resurrection. Can a symbolic victory matter more than a territorial one? If history remembers who crossed the canal, does it matter who drew the final borders? Can dignity be a form of historical knowledge? Does the act of fighting, even without total success, rewrite the narrative of a people?
1978. Camp David. Peace or postponement?
November 19, 1977. President Anwar el-Sadat stepped onto Israeli soil, not as a defeated general, but as a man who had commanded the crossing, survived war, and carried Egypt's dignity on his shoulders, and won the war. He walked into the Knesset in Jerusalem, a chamber that, until then, had only spoken of Egypt as an enemy. The silence was deafening.
Ladies and gentlemen, truly I say to you, peace will never be true peace unless it is founded on justice, not on the occupation of another's land. It is not acceptable to demand for yourselves what you deny to others. And with all honesty, and in the spirit that led me to stand before you today, I say this: you must abandon, once and for all, the dreams of conquest. And you must also give up the belief that force is the best means of dealing with the Arabs.
Fatima, a widow of the 1973 war, said,
I lost my son for this land. I will not see him again, but I will see the land again. That is enough.
Camp David was hailed in the West as a breakthrough, but in much of the Arab world, it felt like abandonment. Egypt broke ranks. Jordan and Syria turned cold. The PLO was left out. Palestinians, still under occupation, saw no change. Sadat's move was bold. It was visionary. But was it just? Or was it strategic pragmatism shaped by exhaustion, economic crisis, and superpower pressure? Did Egypt make peace, or did it buy time? If war is often mythologized, can peace be manipulated too? Is peace that excludes justice for the oppressed truly peace? Can a signature change knowledge or only perception? Is historical compromise a form of knowledge or a rewriting of it? In every Egyptian home, there is a piece of this history. A faded photograph, a medal in a drawer, a Quran with bullet marks. We do not speak of it every day, but it lives in us. We remember Al-Nakba, not as a chapter in someone else's story, but as the fire that lit ours. We remember the Tripartite Aggression, as the moment we chose to stand when others knelt. We remember the Nakba, as a scar we will never hide. And we remember October, as the crossing not just of a canal, but of humiliation. We remember Camp David, as the moment Egypt said, "We will fight no more, but we will never forget." In Cairo's Sayyeda Zainab, Hassan still lights a candle every October 6th. Her son never came back, But she says,
I saw Sinai return. That is something.
in Alexandria, young boys fly kites in the colors of the flag. They don't know the names of every war, but they know what it means to be Egyptian. In Gaza and Nablus, the story continues. Their memories are our memories. Their homes, once our battlegrounds. If memory is collective, is it a valid form of historical knowledge? Can nations inherit knowledge like heirlooms? Does truth require documentation, or does it survive through story, ritual, and resistance? In TOK, we ask, how do we know what we know? Today, we answered with the voice of a people. This is not myth. This is memory. This is history, ours. We will not let it be written only by victors who never bled on this land. We will not let it be erased, softened, or made symmetrical. This story is not neutral. It is Egyptian, and it is true. This is TOKTALK, where knowledge is not only questioned, but reclaimed, dedicated to every Egyptian who lived through the silence, stood in the fire, and crossed the impossible. We carry your stories, not as wounds, but as wisdom.